series on how to do a lease option business. Now, let's start with the basics. A lease option is renting the property with the option to purchase it at a price at a later time. Now, how is that different from a typical rental? Well, with a lease option, mentally, the tenant buyer owns the property. It's still entitled in the owner's name, but until they execute the option to purchase, the seller owns it. Now, we're going to specifically be talking about a sandwich lease option, which means that we have a lease option between yourself and the seller, and a lease option between yourself and the tenant buyer. Now, the lease option between yourself and the seller is what we're going to concentrate on in this tutorial. Step number one. This is a business. It's not a hobby. So you have to be able to have a very large filter and a quick funnel. What I mean by that is don't spend a lot of time looking at properties that don't meet your needs. Here are the 5 requirements. Number 1, it has to be listed. It has to be not listed with a realtor. If it's listed with a realtor, the first thing you have to do when you find out that it's listed with that realtor is tell the seller, I need an exclusion, which means that the seller has to go to the realtor and say, if Reed buys this property through a lease option, he's not going to have to pay real estate commission. Other than that, you're free to do whatever you want. What this does is it allows you to take a look at the property, and if you purchase it, you're not going to have to pay a commission. What happens if you don't do that? Because you're a real estate professional, you'll be deemed to have somehow taken advantage of the seller, and you'll have to pay the real estate commission. Number 2, the property has to be in great shape. It can't have anything wrong with it. If it needs any work, more than mowing the yard, maybe painting a room, walk away. Why? Because you don't own the property. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, but generally stay away from any properties that have any type of big repairs. If you're going to be going after property that does need repairs, you need to own it. Does that make sense? And it has to have a lot of equity. Number 3, it has to be a property that if you rent would have a positive cash flow. Let's say you're going after upper-end properties, and the upper-end properties have a very tight guideline on how much you can rent them for. They're typically going to be negative cash flow. So if you go anywhere more than $1,500, $1,600 per month for rent, if you're not making your mortgage payment, taxes, and insurance, you're losing money. So stay away from those properties that are not going to meet the market rent, and they're going to have negative cash flow. Number 4, the seller has to be willing to walk away from the property without receiving any cash in their pocket. Why would they do that? Imagine that you have a seller that needs to move. They've tried to list this property. They've had it on the listing. They've had it listed. They've had open houses. They need to move. They just can't do anything. Let's say there's not a whole lot of equity there, and the seller says, I just need to get out of this. Now, what you've just done is you've eliminated an awful lot of properties just by that little caveat right there. The seller has to be willing to walk away. In fact, we're going to insist that the sales price be the declining mortgage balance when it's purchased. Now, why would we do that? Let's say right now that the mortgage balance is $100,000. Next month, let's say it's $99,900. Next month, let's say it's $99,800, or whatever the number is. As you keep on moving on with this, each month that you hold this, each year that you hold this, if you hold this for several years, what happens to that mortgage balance? Now, the first few years, it's not going to go down rapidly. After you hold this 4 or 5 years, you're going to start to see a marked decline in the property purchase price because the mortgage balance is going down. What does that mean for you? Each year this becomes a better deal. So let's say that you have a property and the first year it's a skinny deal. Second year it's a okay deal. Third year, fourth year, fifth year, wow, this starts to become a really good deal. If the property continues to go ahead and stay in good shape and the property values don't decline. What happens? Oh, and number 5, you must, repeat, must, put in a clause that you have the right with a 30-day notice to cancel the lease option, rescind the lease option on the anniversary date, which means that every year, let's say you do the lease option on January 1st, every year give a 30-day notice and you can go ahead and step away from this lease option. Now, why would you do this? Let's say, God forbid, that the economy goes terrible, the neighborhood goes terrible, something happens. Your risk is limited to the time of the next anniversary date. Now, why would you do this? I want to always be able to walk away from a property. But with lease options, if I structure this correctly, I'm not going to have a huge problem with that because I have structured this correctly. Oh, and number 6, the seller must be willing to make the first 3 months of payments. Wow, that's crazy, Reed. Who in the world would do that? Imagine that you're a seller and that you need to move. If you had a date certain that you're going to have to make those payments and then you're not going to have to make those payments anymore after that, would you agree to that? Maybe. That's going to eliminate an awful lot of people. Why would I ask for the seller to make the first 3 months payments? Well, obviously, the mortgage is always paid in arrears. So if today is January 1st, you've already paid the mortgage payments you're paying right now or for the last month. So you're going to go ahead and pay January's payment in February, correct? So obviously you're going to make the February payment. Then I need 2 months of marketing time. Now what that means is that'd be March and April that you need to pay. So January, February, March, you go ahead and make those 3 months and I'll go ahead and take care of it after that. Now, would every seller agree to this? No. Which is why, going back to, I think it was number 2, you had to be willing to find out if they're flexible, find out if they're motivated, and then walk away from the deal. Now, I mentioned before about them being motivated. Why does that make a huge difference? They're going to be doing something that's totally different from anything that they've ever done before. So you have to educate them into what they're doing and to show them the advantages. What are the advantages to the seller? Number 1, they retain ownership. If, God forbid, you should get hit by a bus 3 years from now, they get the house back. Woohoo! They're going to have the taxes paid, the mortgage paid, the insurance paid, up until that time they get the house back or that you execute. Which means that each month that goes by, guess what happens? Their credit gets better. So this is a way for them to have no risk. They're looking for, the worst thing that happens is you keep your word and you do exactly what you say you were going to do. That's a pretty good deal, depending upon their situation. Number 2, they get to write off the depreciation each year, and they get to write off the interest deduction each year on their income taxes. They still own the property. They are renting it or leasing it out to you. They can write these off. So they have that advantage, which depending upon what their interest expenses are, that could be several $1,000s each year. That's an advantage to them. Number 3, they can walk away. Now let me repeat that. They can walk away, and after that first 3 months, they're not going to have to worry about this ever again. What does that mean to them? For a lot of people, that means relief. Now, in this day with foreclosures sometimes stretching a year, 2 years, 3 years, that might not be a big deal. But also, what that means is if a person is conscious of their credit and wants to keep their credit looking good, and they're put into a bad situation, this might be something that would be that convincing little argument that would make them feel better. Number 4, you're going to do all the maintenance. Actually, your tenant buyer is going to do all the maintenance, but the seller doesn't have to worry about maintenance ever again. Leaky pipe? They're not going to get a call. Roof? They're not going to get a call. Someone slips and falls? They're not going to get a call. They are out of it. So each year, they get to write off on their taxes their depreciation, their interest expense. Each year, that property is going to appreciate in value, hopefully, which means that if, God forbid, something should happen to you, they get the property back. If you structure a deal so the worst possible case scenario for the seller is you do exactly what you said you would do and it's good for them, is that something that makes sense? How do you structure the deal? Well, before you look at any property, you have to know one thing. What would this property rent for? That's number one thing. If you don't know what it will rent for, you are out of luck. How do you do that? There's a couple of ways. Number 1, go on the internet. Go to realtor.com and see what other properties in that area are renting for. Number 2, do a drive around. Go to the neighborhood and drive around the neighborhood and keep on going wider and wider in your search. Every property that's for sale, you want to call them up and ask them the 5 how questions. How big? How old? How many bedrooms? How many bathrooms? How much? That's for both sales and for rentals. If you start to find that the houses in that neighborhood are renting for $1,000 a month and they're selling for $120, you have a pretty good idea. Now, how do you know what the inside of the house is going to be like? You don't. But there's a pretty good indicator. Do people that take care of the outside of the house pretty much take care of the inside of the house at the same level? So if the outside of the house looks immaculate, if it's trimmed, if everything is just perfect, will the inside of the house usually be in pretty good shape? Yeah, pretty much. It's a pretty good indicator. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good indicator. Number 2 is do you really care? If you get enough houses that are pretty close to that, you have a pretty good idea. Now, if the inside of the house is just a total wreck, that's going to be an aberration. It's going to be a deviant from the norm, so you don't worry about that. You just want to get enough samples that you have a pretty good feel. Now, after you do 5 or 6 or 7 in that neighborhood, you're going to start to say, okay, I feel pretty comfortable with that. Now, can you go online? Can you start doing all these searches? Can you spend an awful lot of time doing this? Absolutely, and yes, you should. It's faster, and it gives me a sense of it being more real when I go out there and actually kick the dirt. And we're going to talk about how to structure the contract for this in our next session.